The room was dim, wrapped in the soft amber glow of a bedside lamp that had been left on for comfort rather than necessity, and in that stillness, Emma lay awake, listening to the quiet rhythm of her own breathing, slow but heavy, as if each inhale carried more weight than it should, as if even the air demanded effort. She had grown used to this feeling. The constant presence of her body reminding her of itself in the smallest movements, in the way her knees resisted when she turned, in the way her chest rose just a little too quickly after something as simple as climbing the stairs earlier that evening, and yet tonight felt different, not because anything dramatic had happened, but because of a thought that had quietly settled into her mind and refused to leave, a thought that perhaps, just perhaps, things did not have to remain this way forever. Earlier that day, she had caught her reflection in the darkened window, not even intending to look, and for a brief moment she had seen herself not with judgment, not with the familiar sting of disappointment, but with a kind of distant curiosity, as if she were observing someone she cared about deeply but had not yet learned how to help, and that small shift, almost imperceptible, had stayed with her throughout the evening. Following her into this quiet room where the world seemed paused, waiting, she turned slightly onto her side, adjusting the blanket around her, and closed her eyes, imagining a version of herself that moved more freely. That woke up without heaviness, that walked without hesitation, and although the image felt distant, almost like a dream she wasn't sure she deserved, it also felt possible in a way it never had before, like a door she had overlooked was now gently outlined in light. Emma did not make any grand promises to herself, nor did she declare that everything would change starting tomorrow, because she knew how those promises often dissolved under the weight of reality, but she allowed herself something quieter, something softer, a willingness to begin, even if the beginning was small, even if it was nothing more than choosing to try once, and then perhaps again the next day. Outside, the night remained still. The world undisturbed by her thoughts, yet within her, something subtle had shifted, like the first ripple on the surface of a calm lake, barely visible but undeniably real, and as sleep slowly approached, wrapping around her like a gentle tide, Emma held on to that single, fragile idea, that change did not need to be loud to be powerful, and that maybe, just maybe, this was where her story would start. Morning arrived quietly, as it often did, with a pale light slipping through the curtains and settling softly across the room, and for a moment Emma remained still beneath the blanket, suspended between sleep and wakefulness, aware of the familiar heaviness in her body but also of that small, persistent thought from the night before, still there, waiting. She did not rush to sit up, nor did she overwhelm herself with plans. Instead she simply breathed, slow and steady, as if anchoring herself to the present moment, and then, with a gentle resolve that felt new yet fragile, she pushed the blanket aside and placed her feet on the floor, noticing the coolness beneath them, grounding and real. There was no dramatic declaration, no sudden surge of motivation, just a quiet decision to do something different, even if that difference was almost invisible to anyone else. She moved through her morning slowly, brushing her hair, preparing a simple breakfast, pausing briefly as old habits whispered to her, skip, delay, avoid. But she chose otherwise, not out of force but out of curiosity, wondering what might happen if she treated herself with care rather than criticism. After eating, she stood near the door longer than usual, her hand resting lightly on the handle, aware of the hesitation rising within her, the familiar urge to retreat back into comfort, but she did not argue with it. She simply acknowledged it, and then, almost gently, she opened the door and stepped outside. The air was cool and quiet, carrying with it the faint scent of morning, and Emma began to walk, not fast, not far, just a few careful steps at first, as if reacquainting herself with movement, each step deliberate, each breath noticeable, and though her body resisted slightly, she did not interpret it as failure, only as a beginning. The street was nearly empty, the world not yet fully awake, which made it easier somehow, as if she had been given permission to exist without observation, and so she continued, one step and then another, until a few minutes had passed, and then a few more. And while it was not much by any standard she had once imagined, it was enough for today. When she finally returned home, there was no applause, no visible transformation, but there was something else, something quieter yet far more important, a sense that she had crossed a small threshold, that she had done exactly what she had allowed herself to do, begin, and as she closed the door behind her, the same thought from the night before returned, now a little steadier, a little clearer, whispering that change might not arrive all at once, but it could grow, step by step, in moments just like this. The next few days unfolded with a quiet rhythm, not perfectly steady, not entirely easy, but real in a way Emma had never allowed herself to fully experience before, and each morning she returned to that small decision, to try, though she began to notice that trying was not always as soft as it had felt on the first day. Sometimes it came with resistance, subtle at first, like a whisper suggesting she could skip just this once, that it wouldn't matter, that rest was more deserved than effort. And while part of her understood the familiarity of that voice, another part, quieter but growing, observed it without immediately giving in. On the fourth morning, the air felt colder, and her body heavier than usual. Her legs reluctant as she stood by the door, hand resting once again on the handle, but this time the hesitation lingered longer, stretching into a quiet internal debate that had no clear winner, only a slow unfolding of awareness. She realized then that change was not just about movement, not just about walking or eating differently, but about learning how to sit with discomfort without escaping it, how to recognize the urge to stop without immediately obeying it, and this realization did not make things easier, but it made them clearer. She stepped outside anyway, her pace slower than before, her breathing slightly uneven, and for a moment she felt the old frustration rise, the familiar thought that this was too hard, that progress should feel smoother, faster, more visible. But she paused, not physically, but mentally, allowing the thought to pass through her without anchoring herself to it, and then she continued walking, one step at a time, accepting that some days would feel heavier than others. As the week went on, Emma began to notice small details she had previously overlooked, the way the morning light shifted across the pavement, the quiet hum of distant life beginning to wake, the subtle strength in her legs that, though still uncertain, was undeniably present, and these details became a kind of quiet companionship, reminding her that she was not stuck, that even within discomfort there was movement. However gradual, she also started making small adjustments to her meals, not by removing everything she once enjoyed, but by adding things she had often ignored, fresh fruits, simple vegetables, meals that felt nourishing rather than restrictive, and though she occasionally felt the pull of old habits, she approached them differently now, not with guilt, but with awareness, allowing herself to learn rather than punish. By the end of the week, nothing about her appearance had dramatically changed, and yet something within her had shifted again, more solid this time, less fragile than before, like a foundation quietly taking shape beneath the surface. And as she rested that evening, her body still tired but her mind unexpectedly calm, Emma understood that resistance was not a sign to stop, but a sign that she was moving in a direction she had never fully explored, and that perhaps, within that resistance, there was something worth continuing toward. As the second week began, Emma noticed that the quiet effort she had been making was no longer entirely new, yet it had not become easy either, instead settling somewhere in between, where each action required intention but no longer felt unfamiliar, and in that space she began to sense something she hadn't expected, a subtle form of strength, not loud or visible, but steady, like a thread being woven through her days. Her morning walks grew slightly longer, not because she forced herself, but because turning back felt less urgent, and she started to recognize the rhythm of her steps, the way her breathing aligned with movement, even if imperfectly, and though there were still moments when her body resisted. Those moments no longer defined the entire experience. One morning, as she paused briefly near a quiet corner of the street, she became aware of how her body felt in a new way, not just heavy or tired, but working, her legs supporting her, her lungs expanding and contracting with effort, her heart beating with purpose, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't see her body as something separate from herself, but as something that was trying, just as she was. This realization stayed with her throughout the day, influencing the small choices she made, the way she prepared her meals with a bit more care, the way she paused before reaching for something out of habit rather than need. Not stopping herself harshly, but simply asking, "Is this what I want right now?" And sometimes the answer was yes, and she allowed it without guilt, and sometimes it was no, and she chose differently, each decision adding another quiet layer to the foundation she was building. There were still difficult moments, of course, particularly in the evenings when old routines called to her more strongly, when comfort felt easier than change, but even then, she began to understand that strength was not about never feeling those pulls, but about how she responded to them, about the space she created between impulse and action. As the days passed, small changes began to reveal themselves, not in dramatic transformations, but in subtle shifts, like the way her movements felt slightly less strained, or how she recovered more quickly after walking, or even how she carried herself just a little differently, as if a quiet confidence was beginning to emerge from within, and though no one else commented, though nothing outwardly significant had occurred, Emma knew something important was happening, something that could not be measured in a mirror or a number, something deeper and more lasting. That night, as she lay in bed once again, the same room now holding a slightly different version of her, she reflected not on how far she still had to go, but on the fact that she had continued, day after day, through uncertainty and resistance. And in doing so, she had discovered that strength did not arrive all at once, but grew quietly, in moments of choice, in steps taken despite hesitation, and in the gentle but persistent decision to keep going. By the middle of the second week, something began to shift in a way Emma could no longer ignore, not because it was dramatic or sudden, but because it felt consistent, like a quiet current that had been building beneath the surface and was now gently carrying her forward. Her mornings no longer began with hesitation alone, but with a sense of familiarity, as if the version of herself who chose to step outside had become just a little more natural, and although the resistance had not disappeared, it had softened, losing its authority over her decisions. One particular morning stood out, not for anything extraordinary, but for how ordinary it felt. She woke, sat up, and without lingering too long in thought, prepared herself and stepped outside, and it was only after she had been walking for several minutes that she realized she hadn't argued with herself at all, that the internal debate which once consumed her had quietly faded into the background. The air felt different that day, or perhaps it was her awareness of it that had changed, as she noticed the steady rhythm of her steps, the way her body moved with slightly more ease, and even the subtle warmth that spread through her muscles as she continued, no longer stopping as quickly as she used to. Later, At home, she found herself making choices with the same quiet clarity, preparing a balanced meal without overthinking it, drinking water without reminding herself repeatedly. And even taking a moment to stretch, something she had never considered part of her routine before. It was not perfection, and she knew that, but it was progress in a form she had never experienced, steady, sustainable, and free from the sharp edges of pressure and self-criticism. However, the true turning point came later that evening, when she caught her reflection again, this time not by accident, but intentionally. Standing still for a moment longer than usual, observing not just how she looked, but how she felt looking at herself, and while there were no drastic physical changes yet, there was something undeniably different in her expression, a softness where there had once been tension. A quiet acknowledgement that she was no longer standing still in her life. She did not smile widely, nor did she feel overwhelmed with pride, but she nodded slightly, almost unconsciously, as if recognizing someone she was beginning to understand, and in that moment, she realized that the transformation she had once imagined as something distant and dramatic was already unfolding, not in leaps, but in layers, built through each small decision she had made and continued to make, that night, as she settled into bed, her body still carrying the gentle fatigue of effort. Emma no longer wondered if change was possible, but rather how far this quiet momentum might take her, and for the first time. The answer did not feel uncertain, but open, like a path that was steadily revealing itself with every step she chose to take. As the third week unfolded, Emma began to notice that the most meaningful changes were not the ones she could immediately see, but the ones she could feel, subtle yet undeniable, woven into the way she moved, thought, and experienced her days. Her walks had become a natural part of her routine now, no longer something she had to convince herself to do, but something she expected, like the quiet start to a day that belonged to her. And while her pace was still modest, there was a steadiness to it, a quiet endurance that hadn't existed before. Her breathing, once heavy and uneven, now found a more consistent rhythm, and though she still grew tired, the fatigue no longer felt overwhelming. Instead, arriving gently and fading more quickly, as if her body was learning how to support her rather than resist her. Throughout the day, she became more aware of her energy, noticing that she no longer experienced the same sharp dips that once left her feeling drained and unmotivated, and even her posture began to shift slightly, her shoulders less tense, her movements less guarded. As though a subtle confidence was taking root in her physical presence, her relationship with food continued to evolve as well, not through strict rules or rigid plans, but through attention and balance, as she learned to recognize the difference between hunger and habit, between nourishment and comfort. Allowing space for both without losing herself in either, there were moments when old patterns still appeared, especially during quiet evenings, but now she met them with understanding rather than frustration, sometimes choosing differently, sometimes not, but always remaining aware, and that awareness itself felt like progress. One afternoon, as she climbed the stairs to her apartment, she paused briefly at the top, not because she had to catch her breath as she once did, but because she realized she didn't need to. And that realization, simple as it was, carried a quiet significance, marking a change that no mirror could capture. Later that day, she found herself moving through her home with a sense of ease she hadn't noticed before. Completing small tasks without the familiar heaviness that used to accompany them, and it was in these ordinary moments that the transformation felt most real, not in dramatic milestones, but in the absence of struggle where it once dominated. That evening, as she sat by the window, watching the soft transition from day to night, Emma reflected on how far she had come in such a short time, not measuring it in numbers or expectations, but in the way her life felt from within, and she understood. Then that transformation was not always visible at first glance, that sometimes it existed quietly beneath the surface, shaping her from the inside out, preparing her for changes that would, in time, become undeniable, and as she allowed that thought to settle, she felt a calm sense of trust begin to grow, a belief not just in the process, but in herself, steady and resilient, continuing forward one quiet step at a time. As the fourth week came to a close, Emma began to sense a change in the rhythm she had grown comfortable with, not a loss of progress, but a slowing, subtle at first, then more noticeable, like walking into a gentle wind that resisted her forward motion. Her morning walks were still there, her routine still intact, yet something felt different, as if the quiet momentum she had relied on had paused. Waiting for her to respond in a new way, she found herself paying closer attention to her body. Expecting to feel stronger, lighter, faster with each passing day, but instead she encountered a kind of stillness, where improvements were no longer as obvious, where each step felt almost the same as the day before. And this unfamiliar experience brought with it a quiet frustration she hadn't felt in weeks. One morning, she slowed her pace more than usual, her thoughts drifting toward doubt, wondering if she had reached the limit of what she could do, if this was as far as she would go, and although the thought was fleeting, it lingered long enough to make her question the path she had been walking so steadily. But as she continued, something within her shifted, not dramatically, but with quiet clarity. As she realized that this moment, this plateau, was not a sign of failure, but a natural part of the process she had entered, a space where growth became less visible but no less important. Later that day, she made a small but meaningful adjustment, extending her walk by just a few minutes, not to push herself harshly, but to gently challenge the stillness she had encountered, and though the difference was slight, it reminded her that progress did not always come automatically, that sometimes it required a new kind of effort, one that was patient and intentional rather than driven by urgency. She also began to pay more attention to the quality of her movements, the way she walked, the steadiness of her breathing, the alignment of her posture, finding that even within the same routine, there were ways to deepen her awareness and engagement. In the evenings, when doubt returned more quietly, she met it with reflection rather than reaction, reminding herself of how far she had come, of the version of herself who once struggled to take even a few steps, and in doing so, she grounded herself in reality rather than expectation. The plateau did not disappear overnight, nor did it transform into sudden progress, but it began to feel less like an obstacle and more like a phase, a necessary pause where her body and mind were adapting, strengthening in ways that were not immediately visible. And as she lay in bed that night, the familiar stillness of the room surrounding her, Emma no longer feared the slowing of her journey, but accepted it as part of the path itself, understanding that transformation was not a straight line, but a series of waves, each one carrying her forward in its own time, as long as she continued to move with it rather than against it. The fifth and sixth weeks unfolded with a quiet sense of adaptation, as if Emma had stepped into a new phase of her journey where effort and ease began to coexist in a more balanced way, and the plateau that once felt uncertain gradually revealed itself as a transition rather than, guiding her toward a deeper awareness of how to care for her body. She no longer relied solely on walking, but gently introduced small variations into her routine, slight increases in pace, brief moments of stretching before and after her walks, and even short intervals where she allowed herself to move just a little faster, not to exhaust herself, but to explore what her body could now handle, and in doing so, she discovered a quiet resilience that had been forming beneath the surface all along, Her mornings felt more grounded, no longer defined by hesitation or even determination, but by a calm sense of continuity, as if this way of living had become part of who she was rather than something she was trying to become, and that realization brought with it a subtle confidence. One that did not demand attention but remained steady and present. She also began to notice clearer changes in her body, not dramatic, but tangible, like the way her clothes felt slightly looser, the way her movements required less effort, and the way her reflection, when she chose to look, seemed just a little more aligned with how she felt inside. And while she didn't dwell on these observations, she allowed herself to acknowledge them, understanding that they were the natural result of the consistency she had maintained. Her relationship with food continued to evolve in quiet harmony with her routine, as she found herself naturally choosing meals that left her feeling energized rather than heavy, no longer driven by strict control, but by a growing sense of what her body needed, and even when she indulged occasionally, she did so without losing her balance, returning to her rhythm without guilt or hesitation. One evening, as she walked along a slightly longer route than usual, she became aware of how far she had come, not in distance alone, but in her relationship with movement itself, as it no longer felt like a task to complete, but a space where she could think, breathe, and simply exist without pressure. And in that moment, she felt something shift once more, a quiet alignment between her body and mind that made the journey feel less like a challenge and more like a lifestyle. As the days continued, this new rhythm settled deeper into her life, carrying her forward with a steady, almost effortless momentum. And though she knew there would still be challenges ahead, Emma no longer questioned whether she could continue, because she had already become someone who did, someone who adapted, who adjusted, who moved forward not perfectly, but persistently. And as she rested that night, her body lighter, her mind calm, she understood that transformation was no longer something she was chasing, but something she was living, moment by moment, step by step, in a rhythm that now felt entirely her own. As the 7th and 8th weeks passed, Emma began to notice that the changes she had been quietly nurturing were no longer entirely her own to feel, but had started to become visible to the world around her, though not in loud or overwhelming ways, but in small, gentle acknowledgments that seemed to mirror the transformation she had been experiencing. One morning, as she stepped outside for her walk, a neighbor she had passed many times before offered a brief smile and a simple greeting. Nothing unusual in itself, yet it felt different, as if Emma was no longer moving through the world unseen, as if her presence carried a quiet confidence that invited recognition. At first, she didn't think much of it, but over the following days, similar moments began to appear, a casual comment from a shopkeeper about how energetic she seemed, a passing remark from someone familiar noting that she looked well, and though these words were light and unintrusive, they settled within her with a kind of warmth she hadn't expected. Standing in front of the mirror one evening, she allowed herself to observe more carefully, not with scrutiny, but with curiosity, and this time, the changes were clearer, the subtle definition in her face, the way her posture had straightened, the ease in how she held herself, and while her body was still in transition, there was no denying that it had begun to reflect the consistency of her efforts. Yet what surprised her most was not how she looked, but how she felt looking at herself, as the familiar distance she once experienced had softened into something closer to connection, as if she were no longer observing a stranger, but someone she was gradually getting to know and appreciate. Her routine remained steady, no longer driven by the need to prove anything, but by a sense of alignment. And even on days when she felt slightly tired or less motivated, she found herself returning to her habits with a quiet trust, knowing that consistency did not require perfection, There were still moments of doubt, brief and fleeting, but they no longer held the same weight, passing through her awareness without disrupting her direction. Like clouds moving across a clear sky, one afternoon, as she walked a route that once felt long and demanding, she realized she had completed it without stopping, without even thinking about it, and that realization brought with it a quiet sense of accomplishment, not the kind that demanded celebration, but the kind that settled deeply, affirming that she had changed in ways that extended far beyond the surface. As she returned home that day, the sunlight casting soft shadows along the path behind her, Emma understood that she was no longer just someone who had started a journey, but someone who was becoming the result of it, not through sudden transformation, but through steady, intentional living. And as she moved forward into the coming weeks, there was no urgency left in her steps, only a calm and grounded certainty that she was exactly where she needed to be. As the final weeks of the third month settled into place, Emma no longer measured time the way she once had, no longer counting days or wondering how far she had to go, because the question itself had quietly faded, replaced by a calm understanding that she had already arrived somewhere meaningful. Her morning still began with soft light and steady breaths, but now there was an ease in the way she moved, a natural flow that no longer required conscious effort, as if her body and mind had learned to move together rather than against each other, and her walks, once careful and uncertain, had become smooth and grounded, carrying her through longer distances without strain, her steps confident yet unhurried. When she passed by reflective surfaces now, she no longer avoided them nor studied them intensely, instead allowing brief glances that felt neutral, almost peaceful, because what she saw no longer defined her progress, it simply reflected it. Her body had changed, undeniably so, lighter, stronger, more responsive, but these changes felt like a quiet extension of something deeper. Something that had been forming long before it became visible, a transformation rooted not in appearance, but in consistency, awareness, and self-respect. One afternoon, as she climbed the same stairs that once left her breathless, she reached the top without pause, without even noticing the effort, and it was only when she stood still for a moment that the realization gently surfaced. Not as surprise, but as recognition of how far she had come. Later that evening, she stood by the window where she had once sat in uncertainty, watching the sky shift into dusk, and she allowed herself to reflect, not with intensity, but with quiet clarity, remembering the first night when change had felt like a distant possibility, fragile and undefined, and comparing it to the present moment where that possibility had become reality, not through a single decision, but through countless small ones made day after day. She did not feel like a completely different person, and perhaps that was the most important part, because she hadn't replaced herself, she had revealed herself, layer by layer. Through patience and persistence, there was no final declaration, no dramatic conclusion to mark the end of her journey, because she understood now that it wasn't ending at all, it was continuing, evolving, just as she was. And as she prepared for sleep that night, the same quiet room now holding a stronger, lighter, and more grounded version of her, Emma closed her eyes with a sense of calm that felt earned, knowing that transformation did not require noise or urgency to be real, that it could unfold gently, steadily, and almost invisibly, until one day, it simply became the way you live, the way you move, and the way you are.